currently pursuing a master's degree at Cardiff University. Otherwise, I work for the NHS as a consultant paediatric and perinatal pathologist and as a medical examiner for the Welsh Medical Examiner's Office. So a niche set of interests, I think you'll agree. Currently at the moment living in Pontypridd with my husband and our 2 rescue dogs, and an unconfirmed number of ghosts in one of Dr. William Price's roundhouse cottages. So that is me. Right, let's see. There we go. Is that change slides for you now?
Yep, we can see that fine. Thank you.
All right then. So today I'm going to present a little of the preliminary research I've done into the appearance of spirits within the Welsh folkloric tradition, a topic which I'm sure you'll be as surprised as I was to learn has never actually been studied within a contemporary academic context before. So in particular, I've looked into the stereotypical figure of the ghost in a white sheet, and white ghosts more generally in Wales to see whether they are as significant here, I guess, as they are over Offers Dyke. I've also looked at possible reasons for this, as well as considering what implications the results have on how we take this research forward. So the best, or maybe the worst place for us to start is probably by asking, what is a ghost? So having heard this question asked multiple times in these ASSAP meetings and never having left with a sensible answer, I think it's probably fair to say that if you ask 100 different people what they thought a ghost was, you'd probably get close to 100 different answers. Now, if you ask those same people then, what does a ghost look like? I think you'll find the answer is a little bit more consistent. Casper, Ghostbusters, the ghosts of M.R. James, the only item a child or a broke student needs to dress up for a ghost is Halloween, the white sheet. This is the stereotypical image of the ghost that has existed for centuries, from our historical accounts right through to our popular culture in children's television, theatres, Hollywood and books. But where does it originate from? Well, the most popular theory is the fact that the dead were traditionally buried in burial shrouds, which were more likely to be white. This theory doesn't quite pass muster in that a lot of these shrouds often ended up being variants of brown or even black. So the use of burial shrouds isn't necessarily a comprehensive explanation behind this motif. But in any case, during the medieval period, ghosts of the dead were popularly depicted in burial shrouds, which we see here. Poorer folk were often buried just in shrouds because obviously a coffin was more expensive. The most popular choice of material was linen. This was predominantly imported in from France. It was one of the more accessible and easily bleached and therefore easily treated fabrics, which had obvious Christian connotations given that Jesus was said to have been wrapped in linen before he was buried. But in Britain, between 1666 and 1814, to support the British textiles industry, it was mandated that these shrouds should be made from wool, and more often than not, these would be white in colour. The move to wool wasn't particularly straightforward, but in 1677, when stricter legislation was introduced, woolen shrouds were in enforced vogue, shall we say. The Act was eventually repealed in 1814, and the move was made then to bury people in their Sunday best. And I think this possibly explains why the narrative around this time changes, with ghosts of the 19th century onwards being more likely to appear in clothes that they were buried in. In the 18th century, you have people like Francis Grose, the antiquarian, who states that ghosts in white sheets at that point were only seen haunting churchyards. Although I think if you look within the accounts, there are actually a number of examples of ghosts in winding sheets which are found roaming the streets of England even after this time. So the vast majority of reports which describe ghosts in sheets, however, actually relate to hoaxers and pranksters. And this is an age-old occurrence. You have accounts from people like Lucian of Samosata, who lived around the 1st century Common Era, who describes how young men used to dress up as ghosts in black sheets, in this instance, to frighten people. Reginald Scott then, in the 16th century, in The Discovery of Witchcraft, describes how knaves found white sheets quite effective in scaring folk out of their money. And I imagine that most of you will be familiar with the image from the tale of the Hammersmith ghost from 1804, where a local bricklayer, Thomas Millwood, was killed in a case of mistaken identity by a chap called Francis Smith, who decided he wanted to go out hunting for the ghost with his pistol. Lots of workmen around this time wore a white uniform, so it wasn't particularly uncommon for this to happen. God knows why, though. And Millwood's wife had even warned him not to go out in his white clothing in case someone mistook him for a ghost. So the idea was obviously quite ingrained within the popular consciousness, even during this time. And it's not surprising then that with all of these innumerable accounts over the centuries of ghosts appearing in white sheets, that it found its home within popular culture, from the magic lantern shows and Pepper's Ghost, which were extremely popular during the 18th century onwards. I know Owen Davies has previously argued that the nail in the coffin, as it were, for this figure being recognised as something frightening within the population was with the emergence of Hollywood, and in particular slapstick films such as Buster Keaton's The Haunted House, which I've shown here, where instead the ghost started to be portrayed as a laughable figure. And so we move on then to contemporary accounts, and in reality the whole reason behind this particular project in the first instance. In 2013, the folklore researcher Paul Cowdell did some research into contemporary expectations and the beliefs of people who reported seeing ghosts, which he then published in his chapter in the Ashgate Research Companion for Paranormal Cultures. He found that none of his 110 respondents talked about the white sheet imagery in their experiences, despite this being the most sort of stereotypical figure. But it was often used as a starting point for interviewees to begin discussing their beliefs. So was obviously still being regarded as a significant cultural figure, even if it didn't necessarily reflect their lived experience. Paul gave an excellent talk to the Folklore Society back in October of last year, which he called Whites in Night Satin, which I thought was particularly brilliant, and discussed this difference and dug a little bit more into the white sheet phenomenon from an English perspective. And that's what got me thinking, well, what about Wales? So what is the Welsh tradition? Does the ghost in the white sheet feature in eyewitness accounts here at all? Or is it as important in popular culture as it clearly is in England? And that's when I discovered that no one has actually really looked into this before. And so that's how I ended up falling down this particular rabbit hole. Incidentally, this is one of my favourite depictions of a Welsh ghost. It's a fine wood engraving by Hugh Hughes, good Welsh name there, found in Peter Roberts's Yr Hanafion Cymreig from 1823, which is a Welsh language version of his earlier English text, the Cambrian Popular Antiquities, which I think was published in 1815, a version which is altogether poorer for its comparative lack of writing about the supernatural and witchcraft in Wales, which the Welsh version has got in abundance. So if anybody wants any of that translating, please come to me. Anyway, starting point, I've spent the past few months reading through literally hundreds of books that might include any references to Welsh ghosts. So there are the obvious folklore texts, then there's the less obvious parish history accounts, the tourist books, rare pamphlets from Cardiff University special collections, manuscripts from the archives here, newspapers, just essentially making a note of anything where a ghost has appeared, either dressed in a white sheet or just dressed in white for that matter. And here they are, translated for your convenience. The first case comes from Llandysul in Ceredigion in Mid Wales, where Shinkin Charles spots a man in white in the field under the trees on his way home from Llanbed on a Saturday night. One time when Daniel Makel from the village of Llandysul and Shinkin Charles were coming home from Llanbed, they reached the Pont Fach, the little bridge of Verdre, as darkness fell. All of a sudden, Shinkin began mumbling with his head hung low. "What's the matter?" said Daniel. Shinkin mumbled for a while, then asked, "Didn't you see anything of the white man in the field under the trees?" "No," said Daniel, "there's nothing there either, if not a fox. Come and see." So the ghost was eventually spotted by Daniel, and when they turned to leave it, it came towards them while making the sound of a trotting horse and disappeared in their hands when they tried to grab it. I wouldn't dare suggest that two men on their way home from town on a Saturday night in rural Wales might actually have just seen a white horse. The second case also comes from Llandysul and from the same storyteller, in fact, and concerns the ghost of an old priest who hangs out round a local well with his white garment about him. At times, the spirit would disturb the people of this parish terribly. The valley joins Blaencwm and Fedrefawr together, and there's a well called Ffynnon Feiriad, the priest's well, because they say an old priest lived there some time ago. They've seen a priest walking many times around the place with his white garment about him, and terribly frightened the men who saw him. The third case comes from my hometown, Abererch in Pwllheli, where the antiquarian Myrddin Fardd describes how Camfa Angharad, which is a local style, was noted for a number of men in bright white clothing that haunted it. So Camfa Angharad was a place notable for its ghost, which was seen by many in various ways, sometimes in the form of a number of men in bright white clothing, moving quickly through each other, then changing to the form of greyhounds leaping over the wall into a nearby field. The fourth case comes from the Welsh anti-witchcraft treatise, Casg an Gythrail, which translates to the devil's hatred, which was written around about 1711. The edition I've quoted from is from 1758. P.T., the author, describes a spirit in shining white clothing, which appears to an ill young man. Another history is printed in relation to a young man of 29 years who was ill, to whom appeared a spirit in shining white clothing, so that it lit up the room in which was the patient, who touched him and healed him, and who ordered that the man should practice a form of prayer, which was nobly worded, and that he had to say or recite this particular prayer out the chancel door, etc. Which is a terrible excerpt to try and translate, but we got there in the end. The last case I found relates to the fighting ghost of Tondu, which is the only case I've actually been able to find which specifically states the ghost was shrouded in white. During 1904, and that is a very important year to remember for later on in the discussion, there came a series of reports from Tondu, which is a place near Bridgend, about a frightening spectre that notoriously tried to strangle people passing the disused colliery in Ynysawdre. This excerpt at the top here was the first newspaper report of the ghoul, where he appeared to 12 workers at the same time, something which in itself is practically unheard of within Welsh folklore. Traditionally, the ghost can only appear to one person, who can then only begin the conversation when the two of them are present, and no more than that. The first report of the apparition comes from the Evening Express and Evening Mail on the 5th of September in 1904, where the spectre was described as tall and shrouded in white. It glided amongst the horror-struck workmen, keeping what appeared to be its eyes, but which were really sockets of cavernous blackness straight ahead, silently disappearing in the distance. 5 days later, the Cardiff Times reported that it had been seen again, this time saying it had the appearance of a gaunt, cadaverous man. And the only curious feature about it, which would identify it with the spirit world, was that in place of eyes were two luminous cavities, which were directed on the startled workmen, seeming to search them through and through. You'll note that this account suggests that you would only know it was a ghost because of the eyes, rather than any particular item of clothing. Similarly, the only eyewitness statement that was reported came from a servant girl, again by the Cardiff Times a week later, this time describing a gaunt, cadaverous figure gliding about the vicinity of an Iseltra farm. So in fact, the only eyewitness account doesn't even mention the attire at all, so no shroud, no sheet. I think it's probably safe to assume, with all this in mind, that this case was a terrible hoax, but one that proved exceptionally popular in the media at the time nonetheless. And there's the fighting ghost there, so it's probably not surprising really that it caused a bit of a splash. And those are all the cases, so only 5 accounts of ghosts dressed in white out of the hundreds of various Welsh sources over a period stretching about 400 years, and only one of those specifically mentions it being a ghost in a shroud. And even then, that's not the most believable of accounts. So how do we go about analysing these cases then? Oh, it's not particularly easy. Primarily as there's sort of very little academic research on the appearance of ghosts in general, let alone in Wales. But a very good place to start would be by looking at Welsh beliefs and to consider any differences with belief systems in England at the time. So there's a lot that's been written in England about the dead, quite literally rising from their graves to trouble the living. One of the more famous examples, of course, comes from Demonology in 1597 by King James I of England, where he quite literally describes the devil as carrying bodies out of the graves to serve his term for a space. Conversely, the notion of the ghost rising from the grave is exceedingly uncommon in Welsh folklore. More often than not, a spirit is described as materializing from the ether or sent down from the heavens. And with this being the case, it's no real surprise then that Welsh folk didn't seem to envisage their loved ones coming back dressed in their finest burial shrouds. Another difference lies in the fact that much of the medieval religious iconography that existed within places of worship in Wales was destroyed during the suppression of the monasteries, and later with increasing puritanical influence during the 16th century. If you walk into any sort of Welsh chapel, and you'll see how stark and austere it is. There's no wonder that so many of Wales's preachers after this period were noted as being fantastic speakers. They had to be, because there was nothing else to bloody look at. And then through destroying this imagery then, the illiterate lower classes, the vast majority of whom only spoke Welsh, couldn't depend on it anymore for their ghost lore, and instead had to rely on their own limited imaginations. So it's no real wonder really that the phantoms of the 17th and 18th centuries in Wales, rather than presenting as these spectral shrouded figures, instead resembled sort of abstractions or even perversions of the mundane, distortions of their universal fears. So things like wild animals, weather phenomena, or fire, lots of shape-shifting ghosts or spirits described as wheels or balls of fire, abstract shapes or humanoid figures but missing limbs, for instance. In the 18th century, we see accounts of the likeness of a man but couldn't see his arms, and he was without a hat. That example comes from Pembrokeshire. In Monmouthshire, a ghost is described as a white thing in the form of a pyramid. And in Gwynedd then, there was a strange fire which kindled in the night about Hadalech town. That is, all of these are examples of familiar forms just presented in a supernatural light. Similarly, while phantom animal sightings reported to the Society of Psychical Research only make up a very small proportion of cases, in Wales we're quite literally crawling with examples. A monstrous bear-like ghoul in chains is described in what is probably the first ever fictional ghost story in the Welsh language in the 18th century by the antiquarian William Williams of Llandegau, the man who incidentally was also responsible for the first folkloric study of a region that was done by a sort of born and bred Welshman, which is his observations on Snowdon Mountains in 1802. You only need to read through a handful of parish history accounts to find numbers of examples of ghostly Welsh donkeys, pigs, sheep, calves, dogs, and turkeys. Again, many of these exhibiting sort of shape-shifting abilities. With folk then having to rely on their imagination, it might also explain why in Wales so many of our ghosts in human form over the centuries present in normal, dull, everyday clothing rather than sheets or shrouds. Corporeal like spirits were recognised as supernatural, sometimes because an item of clothing would be missing. So the example that I gave earlier of the spirit from Pembrokeshire missing his hat is a classic example of this. It's also important for us to consider these cases within the sort of ever-changing Welsh landscape. Over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, just the scale and rapidity of the changes brought on predominantly by the Industrial Revolution saw Welsh identity and culture being increasingly oppressed. In a matter of a century, Welsh had gone from being a universally used language to being spoken by barely half the population. The secondary effects of mainly English and Irish immigration in previously rural and very close-knit communities, especially within the sort of mining communities of South Wales in the valleys here, and the introduction of the despotic Welsh knot, which school children had to wear if they were caught at the end of the school day speaking Welsh. Across the country, I mean, all of these efforts sort of saw the attempted eradication of entire culture by the British state. This led to many of its inhabitants, including some of the folklore authors, and in particular their readers and their contributors, desperately, almost yearning for some semblance of their traditional heritage. People like Professor Jane Aaron have written before about how the Industrial Revolution affected the appearance of ghosts, more so within Welsh Gothic literature. But similarly, we find that many of our ghost accounts in Wales evolved also with a changing landscape. The litany of death omens that are described within the mining communities, for example, is a good example of that. It's also important to consider the religious landscape. So at every point in our history that I've dotted here, it will have influenced a community's interpretation of supernatural events, as well then as the interpretation of those people that are recording those histories. The year of one particular revival is important to our cause here. So 1904, the year of the fighting ghost of Tondir, and also the year of the largest religious revival of its kind in Wales within the 20th century, which was responsible for converting thousands of households across the country, and newspapers playing a huge role in fueling that fire. Well, sort of the previous revival in 1859 had been associated with phenomena such as Canin yr Awyr, singing in the sky, so hearing phantom voices, or even choirs singing in the clouds. Instead, in 1904, that revival was heavily associated with ghostly visions, seen as sort of a sign sent from the heavens. Interestingly, some of the accounts reported during this time are readily comparable with the more abstract apparitions that were recorded in the 17th or even 16th to 18th century in Wales, such as the wheels of fire that I mentioned earlier. So it just goes to show how these accounts weave in with the beliefs and experiences of the people that relayed them at the time. Now, if we're going to be as bold as to claim that ghosts in white sheets, or even white ghosts in general, aside from the obvious white lady motif, aren't significant figures within Welsh folklore, then we should probably consider the limitations of the sources themselves. So firstly, if we remember back to Paul Cowdell's work at the beginning of this talk, he only dealt with eyewitness testimony, whereas the accounts I've been able to find only one of the newspaper reports in the case of the Tondy ghost comes directly from an eyewitness. And if you remember, she didn't report seeing a white sheet at all. You then have those two stories that came from Llandysul, the two first cases I mentioned, two ghosts in white clothing in the same parish, recounted by the same parishioner. Both of these stories had been in circulation within the area for quite a long time, recycled, retold by various people before they were first written down by W.J. Davis in 1896. And that sort of brings us to another limitation within the Welsh folklore accounts, which is essentially the natural evolution of the narrative every time it's retold. For example, if you look here at another newspaper article from the Tondy ghost, this time from November, so 2 whole months from when it was originally reported, you can see how the ghost's appearance has evolved into something which sounds much more horrifying. An exceptionally tall, cadaverous figure was standing there, a silent, motionless sentinel, shrouded in white, the orthodox garb of a genuine ghost. The head, as the frightened observer now described it, was like a death's head covered with wrinkled parchment. The eyes were hollow sockets in which was a cavernous glow. So an excellent example of the Daily Mail at work there. Then if we look at who's been collecting these folkloric ghost stories in the first instance, so people like Thomas Pennant, Richard Baxter, Joseph Glanville, John Aubrey, I'm sure I don't need to point out how they're not exactly salt of the earth country folk. They're not the farmers, the miners, or the quarrymen who would have been sharing ghost stories around the fire during Noson Lawen, the merry evening at the time. What would have been termed in Welsh as members of the gwerin, which is a word used to describe working class people who were extremely knowledgeable about the history, culture, and folklore of their particular area, despite possessing little or no education. For the most part, these antiquarians were wealthy, educated, upper-class Englishmen. Richard Baxter, not so much, he was more middle class, but a theologian nonetheless. While their accounts are obviously invaluable to our understanding of Welsh folklore during this time, these men had little experience of the Welsh lower classes and their customs, and had a tendency to present their own societal or religious biases in their work. This was especially in lieu of the Protestant revival, where the existence of ghosts at the time was used as almost as a rebuke against atheism, usually at the expense of the folk narrative of the lower classes, especially when we consider that these folk would have been monoglot Welsh speakers and largely illiterate, as I previously mentioned. Later collections then from the 19th to the early 20th centuries, with the emergence, I guess, of folklore as a worthy, recognised discipline within antiquarianism, saw a shift of importance of obtaining accounts from the lower classes, while still placing quite a lot of reliance on the content of earlier works despite this. So in Wales in particular, a lot of these collections came from the life's works of various clergymen scholars, often with a vested interest in preserving and amplifying Welsh culture, and more often than not local to the area that they were writing about. So their clerical backgrounds often imparted sort of a degree of bias within their collections. They often write quite cynically about the paranormal and are quite quick to dismiss superstitious tendencies within their flock. But we do have one trump card in Wales, one text that is completely unique in terms of recording early Welsh ghost lore. And that is the work of the Reverend Edmund Jones, a hen broffwyd, the old prophet of Tranch in Pontypridd in Monmouthshire. He was an 18th century independent minister who spent a remarkable and grueling 70 years travelling the length and breadth of Wales on horseback, of all things, not only preaching the gospel to the sinners of the country, but also collecting stories of ghostly sightings, as well as witches, devils, fair folk. And he did so as proof of God's message on earth. His collection was published in 1780 under the title A Relation of Apparitions of Spirits in the Country of Monmouth and the Principality of Wales. Jones essentially regarded Wales as a sinful and cursed country, arguing in favour of the existence of ghosts as proof of the divine. What makes his work so valuable is his propensity for collecting first-hand accounts without discrimination from all social classes, so from servants right the way through to the gentry. His only criterion for inclusion was that he considered the source to be a God-fearing Christian. While this method is obviously far from unbiased, his writing does paint a broad and relatively unfiltered picture of Wales's supernatural belief system during the 18th century. A Relation of Apparitions of Spirits is an exceptional book and in many ways completely unrivaled chronicle of this country's ghost lore, and should definitely be on any folklorist or paranormal investigator's library shelf, although probably not the first edition because the going market rate for that at the moment is £4,000. So another angle that makes interpretation of these cases difficult then is the language. So in Welsh, the word for ghost, ysbryd, is also the same word for spirit, soul, spectre, temperament, emotion, feeling, liveliness, and even breath. It's a word that's used to encompass a broad church then of different supernatural entities, especially in early Welsh accounts. So, for example, if we think back to case number 3 that I mentioned of the group of men in Abererch dressed in white who turned into a leaping pack of greyhounds. While this case was described as being an ysbryd, the appearance of a group of men in uniform clothing might also lead you to suspect that this account has got as much to do with the Delyth Badder, the fair folk, as it does with ghosts proper. Groups of supernatural beings are often perceived as fairies in Wales, and I've included an earlier example here, which was in fact recorded by the Reverend Edmund Jones, in which he describes a company of spirits with speckled clothes of white and red colour, one among them taller than the rest, who I think was perceived to be the leader. These appeared to an innkeeper in his bedchamber in Llanganwyd Fawr in 1767. And if I remember rightly, the following morning, the floor of his bedchamber was covered in red material. So Jones here speculates that by them appearing in speckled white clothing, he was inclined to think that they were of the fairy sort rather than of the more sort of traditional spirit. The transition then of this group of men in Abererch to greyhounds also puts us in mind of the Delyth Badder. These were sometimes known as Cwn Bendith and Mama, although we also have multiple examples of ghostly greyhounds in Wales too. There's a specific case down the road in Clunog of a large spectral greyhound, which was said to span the entire width of the road there, with its head on one end of the hedge and its tail on the other, that was spotted one day by a farmer and was said to haunt the area for a very long time afterwards. Similarly, with case number 4, which was from Casgan Guthrael in 1711, of that spirit in the shining white clothing healing the sick boy. That excerpt, when you read it in its entirety, has more similarities which are more typical of angelic visitation rather than ghosts. Similarly, people like Edmund Jones again have recorded demonic beings as appearing dressed in white in Welsh folklore, and I've included an example here of a demonic entity that was raised by a conjurer called John Jenkins in Pembrokeshire to help find a lost sum of money for a client, where he's described as appearing all in white as a linen sheet, much shining in the moonlight and coming towards the circle, which is the circle the conjurer had drawn in the floor. The problem with the interpretations then of these cases arises when the Welsh language accounts are poorly translated, missing the nuance between ysbrydion, which is the plural in Welsh for ghosts, and ysbrydoedd, which is the plural for spirits. And then where these accounts are also interpreted on an individual basis, so without considering them within the broader folkloric context and in fact the cultural context. You'll probably notice I've purposefully excluded the white lady from this talk because she serves her own stereotypical folkloric entity, I think. Although it's probably worth noting that we do see similar issues with the misinterpretation of this motif within contemporary analysis as well. A lot of this is down to an article that was penned by Jane Beck, who's an American folklorist, who suggested that white ladies could essentially be split into two groups. So the Dynes Mewn Gwyn, the lady in white, which she said was used to describe the more traditional figure of the revenant in a white garb, and the Laddie Wen, the white lady, which was to be used for more, I guess, ethereal spectres that she claimed haunted locations where a violent death had occurred. But when you examine the primary sources, then there's actually little tangible evidence to suggest that these two distinct categories exist in any significant form within the Welsh folkloric tradition. The use of Dynes Mewn Gwyn, the lady in white, as a label is rarely ever found. While the term Laddie Wen is pervasive, that is the Welsh term for the white lady spectre, and it's used to denote most apparitions which present in this particular way. Similarly, Jane Beck has suggested that the image of the white lady was very old, resulting from pre-Christian beliefs, I think she called it, being subsumed into modern religious doctrines, suggesting that I've definitely seen reprinted by a lot of different folklorists and academics with regards to the white lady in Wales. Links have also been suggested between her and the fair folk, and even early goddess or deity worship. In Wales, though, again, if you look through the primary sources, these links are sort of tenuous at best, and at worst misinterpret and over-romanticize those texts. A lot of those assumptions made by previous authors tend to overlook the evidence presented within original Welsh language accounts, which seems to be a recurring theme through a lot of Welsh folklore study, and is something I've in fact tried to address in the book that Mark Norman and I have just written together on Welsh ghosts in folklore. So where does this leave us? Well, I've spent most of this talk telling you how Welsh ghosts don't appear, but there's now a huge volume of work to do looking into how they do present themselves within the Welsh tradition. There's certainly work to be done looking through first-hand eyewitness accounts in various archives across Wales. Sort of how do these ghosts present in the manuscripts of, say, Welsh conjurers and cunning folk? How do they appear during spiritualist meetings, religious visitations during the revivals, so forth? Nobody's looked at these before. And also, how does this compare to the other supernatural entities, such as the fair folk, the demonic beings, and the angels that are often referred to under that same name as the ghost proper in Welsh language accounts? So in summary, I hope I've shown you today how the image of the ghost in a white sheet isn't a significant figure within the Welsh folkloric tradition, not only just in eyewitness accounts, but also within popular culture in Wales, at least not until the late 20th century. Supernatural entities appearing in white clothing are generally more commonly found in association with the white lady motif, the fair folk, and angelic and demonic entities. There's a general lack of research into Welsh folklore, in this instance, the appearance of spirits being the obvious example. And the limitations we've discussed this evening make accurate interpretation of any of those accounts quite difficult without extensive background knowledge of the history and of the culture and of the language. But it's opened up the floodgates essentially for lots of potential avenues of study, all of which I'm sure I'll get around to at some point over the next few years or decades. And lastly, why is this also important? Well, because as we've seen, especially at the very beginning of this talk, when I discussed the role of the bed sheet in ghost sightings and in the history of ghost sightings, very little of that was actually relevant to Wales. And yet so much of the Welsh belief system gets lumped in with the British experience, even in contemporary analysis by respected researchers and academics. Certainly, my preliminary research suggests that folklore, or at least aspects of ghost lore in Wales, develops and then survives independently, and so is perfectly deserving of study on its own merit. So that is me done. Those are some of the, I think those are all the primary sources that I've used, and then some of the secondary sources that I used for this research as well, having not included all the hundreds of books that didn't have any white ghosts in them. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Oh, excellent. I was sitting here just trying to work out, in 2004 or 5, I wrote a paper called How Green Is My Ghostie? How Green Was My Ghostie? Very awful joke, which was colour of raiment of ghosts in the Celtic periphery, which looked at white ghosts, green ghosts, blue ghosts, and red as colours associated with hauntings across Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, but with particular emphasis on Wales, because Wales has the most diverse. And one of my interests is I do quite a lot of stuff on 13th century fairy lore, or mid-medieval fairies. And the question is, how do you differentiate a fairy from a ghost? And very often fairies wear green or fairies wear blue, but fairies don't, or very often, if for a fairy cow, red and white, or a fairy hound, like a Talbot, red and white. But the coloration is a very important part of the fairy experience, whereas apparitional experiences don't usually, until the Castle of Otranto and the development of the 18th century Gothic tradition. They're not normally associated with the kind of white lady ghosts. And I think the Prussian white lady ghost stories come earlier. It was Christmas Eve, and I was really happy because on Christmas Day, I appeared on the front cover of The Sun in a little tiny piece, not The Sun, The Times, the one Great Uncle Bulgaria reads, because my girlfriend of the time had persuaded me to set up a UFO contact line to run over Christmas, and a ghost contact line. We were down at Launceston at the presbytery, and I was at a Catholic presbytery staying with a bunch of nuns with a Jewish girlfriend and her uncle, who was a Catholic bishop, and had no idea what to do for the days that I was stuck there. So it was really quite a strange experience, especially as the nuns kept asking me, are you going to fornicate? Because they seem very concerned about. Anyway, we don't need to go into that detail. They were great people. While I was there, my initial source was I had a copy of Giraldus Cambrensis, Journey Through Wales, 12th century, and he talks about some little men. And from that, I got interested because I had a volume of ghost stories, which I was given for Christmas by Peter Haining, called Ghosts of Wales. I'm sure you've seen it. It's a dreadfully badly sourced book. But I also had a couple of pretty well researched motif collections with me, including Stiff Thompson's. So I just went through and looked at the colours traditionally ascribed to female spectres in, if you like, the kind of classic haunting period. And in the end, I restricted it to the 18th century and onwards, because I decided that the notion of a blue, white, or green lady, and it's the colour of the lady's dress that matters, not the not the skin tone, I hasten to add. We don't have highly ethnically diverse ghosts. And that paper, which was published in the Sci Researcher or the Cipher, I can't remember, one or the other of the two magazines, it should be on Lexion, basically goes through county by county and looks at if there are any recordings. And what we find is that there are a large number of green ladies in Scotland, but they're almost unknown in the mainland England until you get up to about Middlesbrough. And from there onwards, the green lady motif starts to appear. And they often are associated in response with cold lads and shining children, the old folklore motifs. So then I went through Wales, where I looked at blue ladies, red ladies are particularly common in Pembrokeshire, which one assumes is associated with the traditional Welsh dress that's said to have scared the French invasion off in 1790s, was it? I don't know, I can't remember. But yeah, the traditional Welsh dress. But blue and red are colours of ladies that came up several times. Now the question is, are they ghosts or are they folklore? Anyway, doesn't matter, just written a paper on it. Surprised you hadn't noticed it, possibly because it's incredibly obscure. But how do you differentiate a ghost between a ghost in Wales and a fairy?
I think it's actually very difficult, especially the earlier back you go. As I was saying earlier, that's the word that's used, ysbryd, is often used interchangeably. So
Right.
it tends to be, as you were saying earlier, I mean, fairies do tend to be dressed in green in Wales. There are certainly accounts of fairies dressing in white here as well. So yeah, I think it very much depends on the situation that the story is presented in, rather than looking at them as sort of individuals. As I was saying, that's where a lot of the misunderstanding crops up, is looking at these as individual cases and not considering them within a wider context. So in terms of the coloration, as you were saying, the sort of white and red motif, and I showed an example that Edmund Jones had recorded, which he considered more in keeping with fair folk than ghosts. That sort of red and white coloration is something that sort of first appears in writing in the Mabinogi.
Yeah.
So the hounds that Arawn brings with him in the first branch are white with red ears, and they're white with red ears because that's how the audience were meant to know that they were supernatural creatures. That was the sort of hidden code for these are supernatural entities, without explicitly telling you these are supernatural entities within the text. So a lot of the lore that we have then is based on that sort of coloration, and a lot of the supernatural entities that we have in Wales present as white and red because of that fact. I did look briefly, not as part of this research project, but as part of the book that I'm writing, at all the different coloured ladies we have throughout Wales, and ended up giving up because there were just hundreds of them. And as you say, a lot of red and blue, that red and blue cropped up all the time, lots of black ladies as well, and a surprising amount of brown ladies. So it's all, I would say that red and blue combined tend to be as popular as the white lady motif, which is quite surprising. But then again, they're only present in much later texts. They're not there in the early Welsh language history accounts. They're not there at all. They're white ladies. They never come in different colours. The sort of different colours come much later in the coffee table touristy books that, you know, Peter Underwood and his ilk write. That's when they first start appearing.
In the west of England, Cornwall, Devon, and going up to as far as Gloucestershire, there's a huge surge of them round about the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century. And they're associated, because I think they're associated with the Gothic, and they're associated with a certain kind of cultural connotation of dangerous exotic women who are actually kind of vampiric, kind of fairy, kind of spectral, but they're basically dangerous. And it's the woman as a dangerous figure, and the white lady is an expression of both purity and death, isn't it? So, but I kind of got quite into trying to work on that in the early 90s, and then you hit this problem, because I call it the Warwick Castle problem, which is that when I went to Warwick Castle in the late 90s, I took some notes on what they told me about the supernatural phenomena. In 2000, a local newspaper published a really detailed account with eyewitness comments on the ghost stories of Warwick Castle. And then I got to go back, it's only about 5 years later, when I was working on Most Haunted, maybe as much as 7 or 8 years, but it's less than a decade. And the ghost stories that I was told had completely changed, and some of them were recognizably evolutions. And of course, I'm familiar with the notion of the migration of ghost stories spreading from one village to another, of names and details changing. But here, some stories have been completely forgotten, and other stories have become more important and have been obviously retold more often. And other stories had just come in and replaced the previous ones, which were totally forgotten. So if the ghost tour of a castle, which is well documented, can change that much in a decade, you imagine what could happen across a whole nation over a century. And I wonder how you can get past that.
I mean, I was just going to say, my husband and I went on a ghost tour of Caerphilly Castle on, I think it was probably, it was last Halloween, just for shits and giggles, as they say.
Yeah.
And it was quite unbelievable how much of the folklore that was presented on that tour was just wrong and just completely different to what is actually present in the books. And if that's the sort of information that is being shared widely, and it's an extremely popular tour, then it's it's no surprise that our folklore just changes rapidly. You've only got to look at the effects of social media. In Wales, this is a huge problem. So when you have a character limit of 280 characters and you want to talk about a particular ghost you've seen, there's no way you're going to type in Frost Llanelchygog into your Twitter, into your tweets to send that message off. That just gets shortened down to Wales. In the same way as looking at the different customs that occur in Wales, Halloween being a prime example of that, there'll be customs that have just been recorded once in one particular location, and then suddenly that becomes common in Wales or frequently observed in Wales. It's just rewriting the narrative. I think it's important to get back down to basics and actually say, well, it's fine for folklore to evolve because that's what folklore does by its very nature. But it's also important to recognize where these stories have come from, because otherwise we're ignoring large sections of the community to whom these stories have been exceptionally important at one time or another.
I think one of the great advantages that we have now compared with the early 90s was in the early 90s, before the internet, it really was a strange era. If you try and Google, if you do Google searches by year, you'll find that the period from 1990 to 1995, there's actually comparatively few. It's really weird. There's a kind of drop in the number of references you get on the web and historical documents. It's a period that's just before the web and no one cares about. And no one remembers much about the culture or the music of that era, it seems, today. But anyway, ignoring that. In that period, I did not have access to the British newspaper archive, which is now an invaluable source, because we know that, even though they were often presented, the tradition of almost every 19th century newspaper is rationalist and dismissive of the supernatural, but they will still sometimes give quite detailed accounts, like the fighting ghost of, how do you say it, Tondu?
Tondu.
Right, I don't know how you say it, but yeah, I know how to spell it. I found about 5 or 6 different accounts in the newspapers of the time, and obviously that fossilizes the story, because if I'd only ever heard it from Bethan's account that she'd heard when she was growing up, my beliefs would probably have been very different. And when I was able to go back and read the records associated with the Morfa mine disaster, which again I can't pronounce, sorry, Morva, isn't it?
Yeah.
I had the advantage now that I didn't have in the early 90s of actually being able to go back. So the internet does also play a part in fossilizing ghost lore. There's also a whole load of different sites which are called things like a ghostly guide to Wales or a ghostly guide, or spectres of the UK, which have had that peculiar effect of fossilizing ghost stories, because they record them and then that becomes the official narrative version, regardless of what the original folk culture version was. And I think sometimes they kind of clean them up a bit, or they get rid of the more weirder bits or the stranger bits or the more idiosyncratic, or even, may I dare say it, the more Welsh bits. Okay.
Yeah, there's a perfect example of that. That's sort of the thing that I've been trying to counter in the book that I've been writing. So there's a very famous Welsh ghost that haunts a particular lake in, I think it's Dolgella area, who comes out at a particular time of the year and shouts something along the lines of "Gone is the hour, where is the man?" or something like that. And actually, I managed to source the original written version of that story, which is, at the moment, you pick up any coffee table book about Welsh ghost stories, and that story is bound to be in there. But the original version is a completely different lake. It happens on a day when there's the village fair, so everybody's a bit merry. And what the story actually involves is the town realizing that there's a stranger stood at the side of this particular lake. And obviously, because he's a stranger and it's a small, close-knit community, they're a bit wary of him. He stays there all day looking as if he's looking for something, can't find it. At some point in the evening, when a group of lads are going home from the fair, they hear him shouting something like, "I can't find where he is," which is something completely different to what's reported in the in the books today. And then the following morning, they find him face down in the lake because he's obviously drowned, probably been to the fair for the day, had a few too many, and found himself struggling in the waters. So completely different story. And yet now that ghost is sort of set in Welsh canon. And if you try to argue with anyone about the origins of that story, you probably get shot down straight away.
What, by the locals in the pub or by scholars on the internet?
Bit of both.
Both. The other thing is that when I'm reading Welsh stories, I quite often get the impression, because the 18th and 19th century newspapers are often cynical, shall we say, they have a tendency that there's a kind of pointed village jokes going on and references to gossip and things that other people understand, and that some of what look like on the surface to be ghost stories might actually be satire. It may actually be just poking fun at somebody who is unpopular, a politician or a landlord but you can usually tell them because they're just so weird, and you wonder what the hell is going on here. But without that context, without actually being part of the community, they become really difficult to understand. Right, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to ask one more question. So there's four parts. You've got the coastal zone from Barmouth, up to Anglesey, and then you've got the north of Wales. Let's call it just North Wales, South Wales, and the kind of mountainous bit where no one lives. How different is ghost lore across the three regions?
I think, speaking in general terms, the ghosts that Edmund Jones first records across the 18th century tend to, those themes that he introduces tend to stay generally present throughout most of Wales. There are definitely regional variations. So, for instance, in the old county of Merionethshire, you had ghost sheep roamed freely, whereas neighbouring Carnarvonshire, ghost sheep were definitely not a thing, because sheep were a sort of sign of, they were a symbol of Christianity in the same way as you didn't have ghost doves in Carnarvonshire. Yeah. So there's little intricate variations like that between communities and between regions, but on the whole, if anybody wants to read about the way ghosts present in Wales, then even though it's an exceptionally old piece of writing, Edmund Jones is always the first place to go.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I've been reading Kev McClure's stuff. I've got his little book on the Egrin Lights, the famous, during the Great Religious Awakening of the early 20th century, suddenly from a small chapel in the south of Wales, or actually more central Wales, these lights start to appear where the preaching is taking place and the scene hovering around. And it's 30 years since Kev McClure wrote that book, pamphlet. So I'm going through the sources again, and I'm looking at it in terms of a whole new scholarship that's grown up around 19th century Methodism and 19th century preaching, late 18th, early 19th century preaching.
I've written a bit about that in the book. There's a load of unpublished, undigitized material in the archives in Nant Gadel, which are all Welsh language, written in pencil, some of it's written in shorthand, all about the phenomenon that's been experienced during the various revivals. It's just gold, and it's almost heartbreaking that none of this is in the sort of, it is more widely recognized. I mean, anyone can go there, anyone can look through them, but unless you know they're there, it's very difficult.
You also need to know Welsh reasonably well, and you also need to have to know the handwriting of the era, and most importantly, you also have to be able to decipher the form of shorthand that's being used, all of which could prove quite difficult. But luckily, there are people who do know those things. Lampeter has still got Lampeter's in Wales, is it not? It's part of the University of Wales. Does it not still have the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Unit? Don't they have a whole load of documents relating to Welsh folklore there still?
I have no idea, but I'm going to have to look into that now.
Okay, well, next time if you need to talk to them, if you want me to have a word with them, I can certainly introduce you. And I'm sure that Jack is a member. Jack Hunter's worked there recently, and Christopher Mormon was there. So I'm pretty sure they have got a whole load of material that you'll find extremely useful, and it's all at Lampeter. And I think they've digitized quite a bit of it. Right, Caroline, can you take over the questions? Because otherwise I'll witter on. Sorry, I just like to talk. This is what happens.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, and Borodar Delyth.
Thanks.
That's my total of Welsh, I'm afraid. So I was paying attention, but please don't judge me on any pronunciations that I might have that people have put in the questions. I'll try my best. But thank you so much for an interesting talk. Lots of thank yous from the listeners. So the first comment we have was from Rob Gandy. People must have seen some ghosts as being white, which would have been rationalised as shrouds. If ghosts had appeared as being black or blue or whatever, then they would not have been associated with shrouds. One guesses that a lady in white were commonly seen, which might have been mist generated by water, streams, and right weather conditions. Just before you replied to that one, my thoughts on the white ladies is it comes down, I don't know if it was the same in Wales, but there was a tradition and common clothing that people used to wear, and colour didn't really get introduced, like the bright colours didn't get introduced till quite modern times. It was very dull, light creams and greys. Was that the same in Wales as well?
Yeah. I mean, we did. There's again sort of a misconception in Wales that we were all walking around wearing these brightly coloured costumes with very tall hats, but that was only introduced very late on as part of as part of sort of the revival of Welsh culture that happened in Pontypridd, actually, where I am now. It was the sort of hub of that during the 19th century. So yes, I agree. I think with white ladies, as I was saying, it's difficult. There's been a lot written about how they are associated with the fair folk. I think Jane Beck, in the article that she penned for Folklore Journal, mentioned a particular Welsh account called Ffynnon Grassi, where which happens in North Wales, and the story goes that Grassi was tasked with looking after a well, and one night she forgot to put the lid on top of the well, and the village flooded because of it. Now, to me, growing up in the area, in the sort of general area where that happened, Grassi was just the girl who lived in the village, you know, just a normal, regular girl. But there is a version of that story that Jenkins Thomas presents in his Welsh fairy book, where Grassi's, I think, kidnapped by fairies and is transformed into a swan and then comes back as a woman in white. And it's a book that's essentially written for children. It was a book of fairy tales that Jenkins Thomas wrote because he thought that Welsh children at the time needed to know more about their heritage and their folklore. But that's the example that's used as to sort of support Beck's suggestion that the white lady in Wales is somehow associated with fairies, whereas if you actually know the context of why that story was written and the fact that it will have been over romanticized because it was aimed at children, that's not really the sort of local folklore that people hold on to in that area. The argument for the white lady being anything other than just a revenant in Welsh folklore gets a little bit tenuous then, I think.